Good afternoon, dear guests, distinguished honorary consuls of Lithuania. Randy, welcome, and our dear colleagues and speakers, thank you so much for taking the time to participate at today's panel discussion, Putin's Disinformation Gambit, Rewriting the Past to Secure a More Authoritarian Future. We appreciate you gathering here at Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and Museum, which was open a year ago. It's one of its kind museum that we are really proud of its educational mission. And it is quite timely for this specific discussion. We discussed it with the embassy. We will have a few minutes after the discussion, about 30 minutes until 5:30, if you would like to tour our galleries downstairs. And we just opened, we were working hard with Ukrainian embassy. Katerina opened a temporary exhibit right behind this door focused on Holodomor. So thank you so much to my colleagues at the Embassy of Lithuania, Marius, putting this together quite short notice. And thank you to Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation colleagues for the support. Thank you so much. And I will hand over the floor to Artūras Vazbys, Deputy Chief of Mission of Lithuania, to deliver opening remarks.
Thank you, Milda. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our today's discussion. The topic we will discuss today, disinformation and attempts to rewrite history by authoritarian states. It's by far not a new issue. It has its history reaching probably ages, if not more. So why did we decide to organize this discussion on this particular topic today? You might ask, and there are at least few reasons for that. First of all, as you probably know and are aware, the information war is being considered as a part of conventional war. It usually comes together or even before. Currently we are having war in Ukraine, and it's not taking part only on battlefields, but also by trying to win hearts and minds of people around the world. The more resilient we are, the more capable to fight back on this front of informational war, the more chances we have to advance in conventional war and probably facilitate the victory of Ukraine and all civilized world. Secondly, the more we are aware of specific narratives of disinformation spread by authoritarian regimes and the methods they use to spread those narratives, and also the people, the proxies they use, including the Western countries. Usually they don't act themselves. There are some particular mechanisms, so I hope that our today's discussion will help us also to reveal them and to get familiar to the specific narratives they spread. So that would help us, to fight back them and those narratives, and to minimize the damage to our societies. Finally, the more resilient we are, the more capable we will be to help not only ourselves, but also the people in countries living under authoritarian regimes, but not only them, also people in the West and other parts of the world who are already brainwashed just to find them the truth and to come back to reality. So we have a really impressive line of speakers today from academia and also practitioners who are working on those issues on an everyday basis. And thank you for being with us. Also, thanks to Victims of Communism Museum for hosting us and all of you for your interest in this. And I would like to open this discussion by introducing the first speaker, which is my colleague from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania. She is a head of Stratcom unit, well experienced professional, Victoria Urbanavičiūtė, bless you, who worked on those issues for many years in Lithuania and also in international organizations, including being a member of Stratcom Europe team at European Union. So just before leaving the floor to hear one small disclaimer on the screen. During her presentation, there will be some quite brutal pictures, illustrations from the war and other atrocities. So for those who feel sensitive to those issues, I would recommend more to listen than to watch. Thank you once again, and over to Victoria.
Hello from Vilnius, celebrating 700 years of recorded history. For decades, Soviets had been trying to delete or to falsify centuries of Lithuanian statehood. As I address to you today from Vilnius, a city sharing freedom and safety with thousands of Ukrainians forced from their homeland by Russia, a safe hub of freedom for hundreds of people from Russia and Belarus doing their best to get prepared for the wind of changes in their countries, it is more than obvious the Soviets failed. But the very fact that we discuss writing history today, the title of today's event is the best proof Russia still keeps trying. We keep being resilient and doing our best that rewriting the past does not secure a more authoritarian future. The aim of Kremlin's officials and state-controlled media is to attack the statehood of Lithuania and other Baltic states, denying the historical fact, the occupation of 1940, and the powerful anti-Soviet resistance that followed. In recent years, Kremlin has gone as far as launching a criminal investigation into Lithuanian judges that convicted dozens of former Soviet army personnel, mostly in absentia, of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity during Moscow's deadly crackdown on Lithuania's independence movement back in 1991. In August, Moscow court made a decision to arrest those Lithuanian judges. Yes, you heard it right. Puppet court of an authoritarian state issued a decision to arrest judges of an independent state, now a member of the EU and NATO. This is the most recent and one of the many disgustful Russia's attempts to rewrite the past, to sow tension, to threaten. Putin keeps repeating that the fall of the Soviet Union was the biggest mistake of the 20th century, and he spares no effort to restore imperial borders and imperial mindset across European continent. Rough estimates based only on official Russian sources indicate that the annual budget of Kremlin-controlled media and other sources of disinformation is more than $1 billion in US dollars. It gives a clear picture about the scale of the challenge we all face. Few countries on earth, if any, choose spreading propaganda and manipulation worldwide instead of investing into the well-being of their country. Our response to it, and perhaps the only sustainable response, is intergovernmental and society-wide cooperation. It is very important to stick to the right terminology. After years of debates, on the EU level, we have agreed that the challenge we face is not only the challenge of disinformation, it is a huge threat stemming from foreign information manipulation and interference, known as FIMI. The EU has made great efforts in developing media literacy across the continent. On the national but also EU level, efforts are being made to develop critical thinking since the very young age. Within the EU, we do cooperate and exchange our best practices in tackling disinformation. In Lithuania, we move through the oceans of disinformation and steer our efforts against foreign information manipulation and interference, yes, the same FIMI, by producing more facts-based positive communication, exposing disinformation, and building resilience of media and civic society. On institutional level, Stratcom units are now established in many ministries. National Threats Management Center, with a strong focus on tackling FIMI, is gaining strength. We do realize that strengthening the resilience of society is a challenge for generations. The challenge becomes even bigger with the growth of social media platforms. Regretfully, some of the social media platforms, despite all European efforts, have become a safe haven for propaganda of authoritarian states. Social media platforms, once meant to connect people, today are turning this into the space where information manipulation and interference into elections and other democratic processes is regretfully welcome. Behavioral changes take decades. Mistakes and difficulties are inevitable, but we shall carry on. In Lithuania, we have the most powerful example of resilience, book smugglers. Yes, book smugglers, very brave people who, despite all possible threats being jailed or killed, were carrying books and light to Lithuanian families in the darkness of Russian Empire back in the 19th century. We shall seek strength from courageous Lithuanian freedom fighters who, in the post-war darkness, were not only physically fighting for Lithuania's liberation, but also circulating news from the free world. Voice of America and Radio Free Europe are the best proof of media literally changing the world. Now it is our duty to help our societies to withstand any attempts of evil empires to rewrite the past and to hijack our future. We shall carry on.
Good afternoon, everyone, and many thanks to Lithuania's head of strategic communications for that poignant historical outlook and path forward. My name is Michael Hermata. I'm VOC's Director of Communications, and I have the distinct honor and privilege today to moderate this expert panel. Joining us, we have to discuss Putin's disinformation gambit. To my immediate right, Jeffrey Mankoff. He is a distinguished research fellow at the National Defense University's National Strategic Studies Institute and author of Empires of Eurasia, How Imperial Legacies Shape International Security. In the middle, we have Katerina Smagli, the first secretary of the Embassy of Ukraine in the US. And then last, but certainly not least, my good friend, Brian Whitmore, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, assistant professor of practice at the University of Texas, Arlington, and host of the Power Vertical podcast. To kick off our short discussion, we want to be cognizant of everyone's time here. I think it's crucial to note that what we're seeing now in Ukraine from the Kremlin is not anything new. Perhaps it's different in scope, in size, and the human toll, but this is a legacy and outgrowth of the Soviet Union and before. And we've seen this time and time again, the rewriting, the reshaping of history, whether it's from the Holodomor, as my colleague Milda mentioned, we just opened up a new exhibit on the Holodomor, or whether it's Putin's brutal war in Ukraine today. So starting with Jeffrey, I would like to give each panelist about 5 minutes to explore one of two topics. The first being the history and the enduring legacy of Russia's historical revisionism in the past and today, as it relates to Lithuania, the Soviet Union, or Ukraine. And the second topic is sort of where we stand in Ukraine today, in the Ukrainian people's fight for both their sovereignty, but also their very identity, that both on the maps, the very borders, and on paper in history textbooks, and in just regular discourse, the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin is trying to rewrite. So Jeffrey, that's a heavy ask, but the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael, and thanks. Thanks, Michael. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to the museum and to the Embassy of Lithuania for putting on this event. Let me preface my remarks by saying that as I am an employee of the federal government, I have to say that my views are my own and don't reflect those of my employer. So let me take this question of historical revisionism and talk about that a little bit, because I forget who it was who said that Russia is a country with an unpredictable past. Now, I think that is certainly accurate as a statement of fact, but I think it also touches on the importance of history as a political discipline, because how we remember history says a lot about how we understand who we are today and about what kind of political futures that we want. And Russia, before the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union itself, were empires. And empires are multinational. They're expansive. They tend to swallow up new territory over time. And in doing that, they have to create a sort of new narrative to justify the consolidation of control over places that have come into their orbit. And we see this with the Russian Empire in the early modern period under Peter the Great and Catherine the Great and others. And we saw it with the Soviet Union too. And, you know, we can talk about this with respect to Ukraine. We can talk about it with respect to a lot of other places that came under Moscow's control at different times. I know Brian's going to talk about this, so I will leave a lot of it to him. But I did want to, you know, sort of make the case that there was a deliberate process of forgetting Ukrainian history and Ukrainian identity that goes back to the Russian Empire, because much of the land that comprises contemporary Ukraine came under Russian control at different times from the 17th century on. And there had been previous polities in these regions that were dismantled as they were absorbed into the Russian Empire. And part of that absorption also saw the erasure of their high culture. So there was a language that was used in what is now Ukraine during the periods when it was an autonomous region with its own sort of polities. And there's literature and government documents that were produced in this language. But after it comes under Russian control in the early modern period, it gets Russified. And so high culture comes to be dominated by Russian. No, not ethnic Russian, but sort of cultural Russian. So it becomes culturally Russified. And so that language that was used previously continues to exist, but it exists primarily among the peasantry, among people who weren't exposed to the education system, who didn't have the sort of high culture that was being imposed on them from below. And so when you had the emergence of a national movement in the 19th century, it was one that was really based on the peasantry. And there's this association of, you know, Ukrainians and Belarusians with peasants. And historically, of course, there was a peasantry, but there was also an elite, illiterate, high culture that was completely absorbed and forgotten about during the period of Russian rule. And I think that's important today, because when you talk about the narrative that the current Russian regime promotes about Ukraine, it's this notion, it's this idea that Ukraine doesn't have its own history. that it is, part of Russia's own history. Putin has said on multiple occasions, Russians and Ukrainians are one people. He published this article, or I should say it was published under his name in 2021, where he talked about the common identity of Russians and Ukrainians, and said that, there was no Ukraine without Russia. And of course, that rests on this whole history, going back to the 17th century of what had been a kind of separate Ukrainian historical narrative being subsumed and being dismantled within the confines of a Russian-dominated empire and then a Soviet empire. And so there's this long-term process of seeking to rewrite history that Putin's ideas about, I should say they're not his, but the ideas that Putin puts forward about Ukrainian history rest on. And I think without that long history of attempting to subsume, absorb, and kind of deny the separateness of Ukrainian identity, you don't get what you have today, which is a political and cultural elite in Russia that really doesn't believe that Ukraine is a state or that Ukrainians are a real people. And that sort of mental amnesia, I think, is one of the big challenges that we face in terms of what a future looks like, because again, this isn't just Putin, this isn't something that's come out of thin air, but it rests on a whole multi-century history of erasure.
Thank you. Katarina?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Many thanks to the Victims of Communism Museum and Lithuanian Embassy for organizing this extremely important discussion. Years ago, I published together with Ilya Zaslavsky a short analytic piece titled Hybrid Analytica, how Western think tanks and universities support, maybe directly or indirectly, Russia's falsified narratives. There was a small part on history in it. So if you'd like to follow up on this, you can Google by my name and by the research title. There will be a lot of interesting material in there. When we look at Russia's society today, it almost seems like it is a country that lives in the past, because truly Russian leadership being unable to offer new vision of the future. It is unclear, what Putin is trying to achieve and what kind of Russia he is trying to build for his people. He is taking attention of his people and his society into the past. And it is truly fascinating to observe this new type of myth-making in Russian society, and them going back into the past. It is obvious that Russia could have chosen a different path during Perestroika and in the early 90s when Soviet archives were finally opened. Russian historians could write and did in fact started publishing a lot of interesting material based on declassified archival sources about Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, about Holodomor, about illegal deportation of Crimean Tatars, about murder of Polish officers in Katyn, and many other subjects that were not available before. But then all of a sudden you have a new ruler named Vladimir Putin, a KGB guy with a special mindset who tries to use history in order to justify his policies and to kind of offer to the people and to the entire world his vision of how it really happened. And add to these absolutely draconian laws, which now forbid historians to express their opinions freely. And if you don't follow a special narrative, the official narrative, you risk ending up in prison. Some get 8 years, some get 25 years, depending on how strong the opinions that you own divert from the official line. So this what is making this falsified historical narrative possible. And of course, Putin is using a number of instruments and mechanisms to promote those narratives. First, the historians who are employed by the Kremlin, those who work in state-owned universities. There are no independent universities in Russia nowadays. There is the media, the press, the journalists, and of course, a number of historians here in the States, in European countries, who consciously or unconsciously serve as sometimes Russian agents. There are not as many now, again, thanks maybe to the horrific outcomes of Russia's invasion. But believe me, even in 2014, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea and started the war in Donbass, there were voices in the West who tried to justify Putin's actions in Ukraine by some historic grounds and motives that could have motivated him to act one way or another. So they started whitewashing of Stalin, they started whitewashing of other crimes committed by the Soviets. Memorial already faced significant pressure from the authorities before it was completely closed just a couple of months ago. And criminal cases opened against some of Memorial staffers. So the two essays, one was already mentioned by the previous speaker about historical unity about Russians and Ukrainian, which was completely unsustainable from historiographic point of view. I remember Yale professor Timothy Snyder almost compared it to a situation when you meet a rich, crazy friend who has his ideas about history and who starts telling you what he thinks about history. And because you see that the guy is simply crazy, you have nothing else to do but just nod and silently leave his or her house very, very fast. And of course, that essay demanded a response, but unfortunately, there was no this deafening chorus of response, neither in Russia, no in Ukraine, and no in the West. And maybe Putin, again, seeing no official and public response from historians, also used this essay as a pretext, because when he said, when it was first published, that it is an open declaration of war and that it was a very dangerous essay, as I said, unsustainable from historiographic point of view, but very dangerous, I say, from a political point of view. But there was also another one, which he published when Russia celebrated the 75th anniversary of its victory in the Second World War, where he, again, vilified the Soviet Union for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And just with a switch in the mind, you can continue the logic that he presented there, that Poland was not really a state, that it was falling apart, that somehow it had to be divided between the Soviet Union and Germany. And if you just continue his logic a little bit further, you will understand that he was already in his mind talking about Ukraine, because in his mind, the state of Ukraine has no legitimacy. And if it has no legitimacy, and if Ukrainians are Russians, but they just don't know that they're Russians, it was some sort of a Western conspiracy that made Ukrainians believe they're different. It's his duty and the duty of all Russian people to liberate Ukrainians from this falsified historic narrative that they had been consuming, again, as a result of some bad actions and motives on the Western part. So we can talk a lot about why it is going on and why it is happening and what Putin thinks about history, whether for him it is really a divine subject that has a certain path and the facts are simply assembled to prove this path, whether for him history has no responsibility, because if you think about it, and by the end of the day, there is always, if history is well written, if history is well researched, there should be some moral grounds. And books today, at least, they are written and published to understand, what we did wrong in our past to ensure that those mistakes and those crimes are not repeated. So for Putin, there is no such motive. In fact, he justifies his crimes, the crimes that his army is committing today in Ukraine, by looking in the past and rewriting history. And what's also wrong is that Putin writes about subject that he doesn't know. We remember that a historian who starts with a thesis, he typically or she goes to check his thesis verified vis-a-vis oppose with sources. You know, you typically travel to a country that you want to study, you study the language of this country, you go to archives of this country and open the sources, and based on facts and based on material that you analyze, you know, just as all first-year history students would typically do, Putin does nothing of that. He doesn't go to Ukraine, he doesn't speak to those people he occupied, he doesn't speak to families of those who lost their relatives and friends. He doesn't know the subject that he is talking about. Now, what to do and how can we all react? The only possible solution is first to have a better expertise on the subject that we discuss. Again, if there is anything good, positive that came out of Putin's unjustified, brutal war against Ukraine, is that there is finally an agency, Ukrainian agency, strong understanding of Ukraine's presence on the field of European history. People suddenly realize that Ukraine truly has one of the most fascinating and interesting histories in the world. And by itself, it offers us a great opportunity to write our history in the most fascinating, innovative, and interesting way, you know, and truly tell our story, you know, the way that only we Ukrainians can tell it now. And I think we already quite succeeded in this, providing this new, offering this new narrative that fascinates our partners, our allies, and hopefully other countries that have become victim of this authoritarian tendencies. And also not to do what Putin is trying to do in Russia. Our archives are open. You remember that several years ago, Ukraine opened all its archives, Secret Service archives. Any historian who is interested in Ukraine's past can freely come and look for materials. We're also very proud by our partnership with the Holocaust Memorial and Museum here in Washington, D.C., which digitalized 10 million copies of documents related to Holocaust. This by itself, such openness and such ability and readiness to be open about our history, openly discuss it, is something that will ensure that Ukraine will win this disinformation battle, and that its history will continue fascinating our partners and friends. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Milda. Thank you to the VOC. Thank you to the awesome Embassy of Lithuania, which is my neighbor up in Adams Morgan, and they're very good neighbors. Also want to add that the Lithuanian Embassy, if my information is correct, is the longest continuously existing embassy in Washington, D.C. And the reason for this is that, of course, the United States never recognized the illegal Soviet annexation of the Baltic states. This is an example of what can happen when you get history right. This is what happens when you get history right. I want to pick up on what both of my colleagues are saying. Both Jeff and Katya were saying interesting things about history, and I want to continue this theme of history, but I want to kind of shift the aperture a little bit about our complicity in the incorrect historical narratives that are out there. And by ours, I mean North American and Western European complicity in this. When I read Putin's article on the so-called historical unity of Russia and Ukraine that both of my colleagues referred to, after banging my head against the wall and then seeking psychological counseling, the first thing that came to my mind was we are partially guilty for this. Because as I read this incorrect history that Putin was presenting in this essay, what struck me was how closely it tracked with the version of Russian history that I was taught at a very good American university. We got the history wrong for most of our lives. I tell my students at the University of Texas Arlington, you're lucky, because when I was a college student, I got the wrong history. I got this imperial version of Russian history that showed this direct line from Kievan Rus to the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, to the Tsardom of Russia, to the Russian Empire, to the USSR, and everything else was just peripheral. This thing called Ukraine, we called it the Ukraine at that time. It's weird, we don't say the Germany or the Canada, but for some reason we said the Ukraine. We got the history wrong. And why did we get that history wrong? There's a very specific reason. This is no great secret why we got this history wrong. After the revolution of 1917, white Russian historians emigrated to the West. Now, the white Russians were not liberal Democrats. They were monarchists, and a lot of them became fascists in the 20s and 30s, right? But they emigrated to the United States, and they took with them this imperial version of Russian history that was taught in the Russian Empire and continued, by the way, to be taught in the Soviet Union with minor ideological modifications. And they brought it to our American universities and our Canadian universities and our Western European universities, and generations upon generations of American, European, and Canadian students got the wrong history. They got the wrong history. We tended to look at Ukraine as this peripheral appendage of Russia without its own agency that wasn't a nation in its own right. To paraphrase Vladimir Lenin, American historians became what he called polezny idioti, or useful idiots, right? Without realizing it, our own historians were teaching us the wrong history, because this is the history that came down generation after generation. And now, when I talk to colleagues about this, it's very difficult to shift. You talk to Russian historians of Russia, not Russian historians, but American historians of Russia, you're like, well, I'd have to redo my entire curriculum. I've always taught Russia beginning with Kiev and Rus in this direct line. I'm like, well, okay, that's all well and good, but let's get it right. I mean, I'm working on doing this at the University of Texas Arlington right now. I'm trying to get Ukrainian studies into the curriculum, separate and distinct from Russian studies, right? I'm trying to get the Ukrainian language taught. It's a long slog to get this done, and this is just at one university. Now, I don't want to besmirch all history departments. Some universities have done a wonderful job of this. Harvard and Yale really stand out. Serhii Plotky and Tim Snyder at Yale, Serhii Plotky at Harvard but unfortunately, they're the exceptions. They're not the rule. And until we get this history right, then we are going to be susceptible to all the micro narratives that fall within this history. How many times have we all heard, oh, Ukraine's always been part of Russia. Belarus is just, part of the historic Russian lands. I hear this not.
Crimea has always been Russia.
Crimea has always been Russian, but Belarus and Ukraine have always been Russia. Even the name Ukraine, I actually looked up the etymology of this, because Russians always told me, and I didn't know any better when they told me this, that the name Ukraine, Ukrainia, on the outskirts comes from the Russian language, meaning the lands on the outskirts of Russia. This is wrong. I actually looked up the etymology. It's actually from the Polish language, and it came during when Ukraine was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It's from the Polish language, Ukrainia of Poland, right? That's when the name Ukraine came into being. So even right down to the name of the country, the name Rus, from Kievan Rus. Does anybody know what Rus means? It has nothing to do with Russia. Rus is an old Nordic word that means men who row, because Kievan Rus was a Viking settlement originally. It was originally a Viking settlement. So we need to get all of this right, because if we don't, then all of those micro narratives that we've all been talking about that are so damaging in their own right, we're much more susceptible to them. And getting the history right is like a vaccine. It's like inoculation against this this virus of disinformation. The facts, I don't have to tell people in this room, but I'm going to do it in the remaining time of the history of this. Kievan Rus existed from 879 to 1240. It was a Viking settlement. It had nothing to do with Russia or Ukraine yet. Both Russia and Ukraine emerged from this, as did Belarus. After the Mongol invasion in 1240, what is today Ukraine and what is today Belarus became part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And both Belarusians and Ukrainians will tell you this is the kind of golden period of their prehistory, really. After the merger of the Polish and Lithuanian crowns in 1569, they both were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They didn't become part of the Russian Empire until 1795, relatively recently in our history. And then, of course, you had the brief period of the independence of both Ukraine and Belarus from 1918 to 22. Then you had the USSR, of course, from 22 to 91, and then in independent Ukraine and Belarus from 91 onward. If you do the math, and I actually did the math for my students to kind of make this really clear, Ukraine and Belarus were ruled by Moscow for 192 years, and they were ruled not by Moscow for 590 years. It isn't even close. Ukraine is a European nation, and Belarus is a they are both European nations that have been artificially separated from Europe by Russian imperialism. And we need to get this right. We need to get this into our universities. We need to repeat this over and over and over again. I talk about this at almost every talk I give. I probably drive people who have seen more than one talk crazy, but the way you get things through is by repetition and repetition and repetition and repetition. So I think this is the point I want to make here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. So there's a lot of avenues that we can take now. But I think one of the core themes that we heard so far is that whether it's through the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, or Russia and Ukraine today, there is this enduring legacy of not only rewriting history, but of making sure that one power stays in power. And what we're seeing right now is not just a war of bullets, but it's also a war of ideas. So perhaps, and hopefully this is not jumping ahead too much, but flipping the script, what does the future of the Russian identity look like, hopefully in the post-Putin world? Feel free to jump in.
That depends on the Russians. If you ask me to put a gun to my head and say predict, I would say it looks pretty much like the Russian identity we see now. I used to be a Russia optimist. Experience beat that out of my system. Until Russia has a catharsis, until Russians collectively as a society say we cannot be like this anymore. And I, incidentally, in terms of positive, because I'm an optimist by nature, despite appearances to the contrary, I see some signs of this right now. I highly recommend everybody read Mikhail Zygar's new book called War and Punishment, Putin, Zelensky, and the Road to Russia's Invasion of Ukraine. Now, Mikhail Zygar, I don't know if any of you know who he is. He's a Russian journalist, currently living in exile in New York City. He's the founder of Dosh TV, which was one of the few independent media outlets in Russia. And I know Misha, and he's a really sincere, really honest guy who is really, 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 really bothered by what he's seeing in Ukraine right now. And he decided to write a book about it. It's only been published in English. He says when it's finally published in Russian, he's going to have to self-publish it, and he's probably going to have to get bodyguards. And I'll tell you the truth, I read this book and I couldn't believe I was reading something written by a Russian, even an intelligent, liberal, thoughtful Russian. This is farther than any Russian liberal ever went in assessing the Ukraine situation. It's the first Russian writer who I saw who got the Ukrainian history right, and who said, we are all guilty. We are all guilty. We have to look at our own culture and say that it led to this imperial legacy. He attacked Alexander Pushkin. Right? Imagine a Russian writer in print attacking Alexander Pushkin. He did, right? He did, and as well as all the other great Russian writers. So this is the beginning of it. And what Misha told me when I had him on my podcast, he said, I want to start a conversation. I want to start a conversation. And again, I'd highly recommend that. But until that catharsis happens, until we see more people doing what Mikhail Zygar did in this book, and the thought process and the painful thought process that must have gone into it beforehand, until we see that catharsis, until we see happen in Russia what we saw happen in Germany after the Second World War, nothing's going to change, in my opinion. Nothing.
If I may add to this, I believe that with his historic essays, Putin did a great disservice to his own people, because if you look at the last piece on the unity of Ukrainian and Russian people, you get truly shocked by how little he says about Russians themselves, about the Russian identity. It almost sounds like Russians can only identify themselves vis-a-vis another nation against whom they are fighting. And if you understand that this war and this perpetual desire to subjugate other nations is the only thing that makes the core of your national identity, then this need to conquer, this need to continue this neo-revanchist and neo-imperialist tradition will continue unless, as Brian just said, the Russians reconsider what centuries of the history and the historiographic narrative that they have been taught themselves and been teaching others about. And I'm not as optimistic as Michael Ziger. I believe that it will take many, many decades, if not centuries, for Russians to finally come to these conclusions, because it seems to me that all independently thinking Russian historians and intelligentsia, as you know about them in Russia, they have already left and now in the West. And those inside Russia, I'm not sure that they will have in the next years, as long as Putin remains in power, any venue to openly, Mikhail Ziger has a luxury of discussing and publishing his books only because he's in the West. He is not inside Russia. So for them to start this discussion inside the country will demand liberalization of Russia and ultimately Ukraine's victory in this war.
I just briefly add that Misha's not optimistic. He knows what he's up against.
I guess I would just say that I'm not terribly optimistic on this front either. If I could provide an overview of the argument from the book that you mentioned, it's that you have these post-imperial states that ambitious leaders look to this imperial past as a source of legitimation, which is a point that Katya made about Putin. And that well of ideas and symbols and narratives is always there. And moreover, there are physical legacies of empire that these states are able to take advantage of. And in the Russian case, it's things like the presence of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. It's the presence of Russian diasporas. It's this idea of a Russian world, or Ruski Mir. And those are going to be there, sort of whatever else happens. And as long as they're there, that temptation to manipulate these tools, to use them as ways of promoting Russia's status as a great power and to promote the power of an individual ruler is going to be there. And that's a phenomenon that you see across the board with these post-imperial states. So I think as long as Russia remains that kind of post-imperial state, you're going to continue to have this problem. Obviously Germany underwent a fundamental transformation and a whole process of what in German they call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which is sort of grappling with the past and making amends in a lot of ways for the horrible things that Germany did in its past. But that only occurred after a monumental military defeat and military occupation and the fundamental rewriting of the political institutions and social contract of the Federal Republic of Germany. I don't foresee that happening with Russia. Even if Ukraine is victorious in this war, you're not going to have foreign troops marching down Tverskaya in Moscow and imposing a new government that is going to prioritize grappling with the past. So I think that we're in for a long struggle over this issue. And I think that the war has made clear just how deep this imperial narrative goes. Again, it's not just about Putin. It's not about replacing the leader. It's not even about replacing the system. But this is an ideology. It's a narrative that has a stronghold on the Russian intelligentsia, on the educational system, and in the media.
To the panel, do we think that now the free world has awoken to this reality? We've seen time and time again, whether the invasion of Georgia, events in Moldova, Ukraine in 2014, Ukraine in 2020. But even through all those events, we still have talks of resets. We still have talks of not wanting to aid Ukraine because of fear of escalation. Is that discourse, that concern, a thing of the past, or is that something that this potential Ukraine fatigue will continue on, even though the facts are clear?
Well, I would say in brief, just look at the recent election in Slovakia and look at the dysfunction in our own Congress, which has centered on a lot of things, but assistance to Ukraine became the sticking point that ultimately held up a mirror to our own dysfunction. So I think this idea of Ukraine fatigue is very much there, and I think is infecting our domestic politics here and in Europe. And that's a fundamental reality. And I think it's one that people who want to see Ukraine victorious have to continue to push on and continue making the case for why this is a fight that matters, not just for Ukraine, but for the United States and for Europe and for the idea of the kind of world that we want to live in. I do think the concerns about escalation that you mentioned, those are real. And I think we're pushing up against what we're seeing as red lines with increasingly sophisticated military deliveries to Ukraine. But the potential for escalation is real. And for countries like Georgia or Moldova that are on the front lines of this conflict, the fear of Russia doing something to destabilize them or to use military force against them is very palpable. And I think that's a reality that we have to take seriously. And then there's the issue of vertical escalation as well. Will Russia escalate to use weapons of mass destruction? We don't know. I think we have some agency over whether they do or do not, based on how we deter them, what we communicate to them. But I think any defense planner, any official who doesn't take those fears seriously is being derelict of his or her duty.
Brian?
Yeah, I think we see positive and negative signs. One of the positive things that's come out of this horrible war is that there are more people in the Western world that are aware of Ukraine than ever before. And that's a good thing. The way I put it is the rest of the world finally found out how awesome I always knew the Ukrainians were, right? I see Ukrainian flags flying in Texas, like in suburbs of Dallas, right? We don't say the Ukraine anymore. Nobody says that anymore. It's a little thing, but it means a lot, right? On the flip side, there still is this this tendency to say, well, let's try to seek a negotiated settlement. I saw a cartoon that really stuck with me. It had on one side of the cartoon Russians saying, we want to kill Ukrainians. And on the other side saying, Ukrainians saying, we want to live. And in the middle was Elon Musk saying, compromise, negotiate, right? And this is still out there. And what I loved about that cartoon is it really, like, what on earth are you going to be negotiating about here in this situation? So for every good, there's a bad. I think we've made progress. I tend to try, kind of see the glass is half full, but it's got to get all the way full pretty damn quick. I had one of my students come up to me the last time I was down in Texas. I visit the university once a semester, and one of my students, one of my very best students, came to me. She was part of the Slavic Studies Club, and they're organizing all these events to support Ukraine. And she came to me and she said, Professor Whitmore, is it true that Slava Ukraini is a fascist slogan? And I said, absolutely not. Where did you hear that? And she said, because one of the cafes where we're doing an event, this is in a suburb of Dallas, Texas. One of the cafes where they're doing an event, that the proprietor wouldn't let them have Slava Ukraini on their advertisements for the event because it's a fascist slogan. And now I explained to her the origin of the phrase Slava Ukraini, which is no more fascist than saying God bless America, right? It comes from a poem by Taras Shevchenko. That's where it comes from in the 19th century. But the very fact that this can happen now, almost 2 years into this war, bugs the hell out of me, right? We're not going to eradicate every piece of disinformation. I don't think the proprietor of this cafe had ill intentions. I think this person was just misinformed because Russia's been able to capture these historical narratives. So I think we've made a lot of progress, kind of psychologically, mentally, kind of in our own minds, understanding what we're dealing with here. But we still got a long way to go.
Yes, let me add to this. We see now a lot of progress in understanding of Ukraine and in interest. Many American universities now open professorships for Ukrainian studies. Many universities start offering courses on Ukraine's history, and luckily they are being taught by Ukrainians themselves who had to flee their country due to Russia's aggression. You probably know that the Association of Slavic European and East Eurasian Studies will hold its annual conference in November. And the title of this conference has only one word: it's decolonization, and it's extremely important trend. We've been kind of fighting for it for many years, ever since Ukraine declared its independence and other post-Soviet countries declared their independence, in order to demonstrate to the West, which had been, as Brian explained so elegantly in his introductory statement, been looking at Ukraine's history through the prism of sometimes Russian historians who immigrated to the United States. So now we need to decolonize the history, the art, the language, the historic narrative from the narrative that was promulgated by historians with Russian studies background. But on the other hand, we also see that being unable to win Ukraine on the battlefield, Russians are utilizing hybrid war mechanisms to once again divert attention of our Western allies from what is going on in Ukraine and why Ukraine deserves Western support. And they rely on all sorts of groups on the internet, on YouTube. There is a growing number of new YouTube channels, which you have the same number of speakers day in and day out, promulgating the same narrative about all sorts that go wrong, either with Ukraine or the war or the West's understanding of Ukraine and the war. And it is really disheartening and worrisome. So I believe that we should all take this very seriously and understand that this war is going on only in Ukraine as we speak, and not only on the battleground. The battleground is here in the information space, in public debates and public discourse. And what we really need to understand that ignorance, unfortunately, plays and helps Russia to kind of continue brainwashing of gullible individuals, who don't care to go into Sergei Plokhy's books or Timothy Snyder's books, which are sometimes 600 pages. It's much easier to go on the internet and to trust my friend John, who just posted something on Facebook, and truly believe these narratives, which have sometimes a very specific origin in one of the Kremlin's offices.
Thank you. Do we have time, or we can make time for two quick questions? So we have this gentleman right over here.
Yes, following up on this discussion, going back to the mid-2030s, we had the isolationist nationalist movement in the U.S., not to mention the Klan and everybody else. We are repeating, it seems, that same period, the same situation. And ironically, without getting into it, the same political party was doing it in the 30s, is now doing it now. How much do you see the impact of political reasons behind it because of the current administration supporting, tying in with the isolationist, nationalistic approach?
And then do we have one more question? Going once, going twice. Okay, so being cognizant of our time here, feel free to answer, but the question is impact of politics on not just American, but I suppose also Western isolationism and willingness to aid our ally Ukraine.
Okay, as a civil servant, I'm not going to comment about American politics. About global politics, I think that there are a couple of things going on, particularly in Europe, that are the source of some of the weakening of cohesion around continued support for Ukraine. Some of it actually has to do with us. Some of it has to do with concern in a number of European countries about the consequences of a less engaged, less supportive United States. And if the United States is going to be less supportive or less involved, there's, I think, a belief that you're going to have to make some kind of accommodation with Russia because you don't have much other alternative. And I think that's motivating this sentiment in some places. Some of it, I think you have places in Europe where Russian narratives remain very influential, whether that's because of resentments about the way that politics and society have evolved in the post-communist period, which you see in one country that I know better than some of the others is Germany, where you have certain segments of society that feel that they've been excluded from the new world that's emerged in the post-communist era, and have this kind of nostalgia for something that existed, or as they see it existed before. Some of it is economic. The belief that the war is behind the economic difficulties that people are suffering with high energy prices and inflation and slow growth and everything else. And I think this is an area that Russian media and information operations has been keen to promote. And then the issue of immigration and cultural change, which I think is an issue here, but it cuts a little bit differently in Europe because it's something that Russia actively uses as a wedge issue, while at the same time, attempting to use to direct immigrants to cross into Europe and manipulate it in a way to actually continue stoking some of these tensions. And so this kind of vulnerability to Russian disruptive measures, whether it's in the information space or through the insertion of migrants or economic manipulation, I think contributes to a kind of Ukraine fatigue or wariness in a number of European countries. And I think that we're starting to see the effects of that in places like Slovakia and potentially in other countries that are going to have elections in the coming months and years.
Now, Brian is raising his hand over here.
As a non-U.S. civil servant who partially makes his living whispering in the ears of civil servants, I can speak a little more freely about American politics, and I'm concerned about what I'm seeing on both the right and the left fringe for different reasons. I think there's an issue on the right fringe, and we have to be really honest with ourselves here. And this is not an indictment of the entire Republican Party by any stretch of the imagination. And I think Ronald Reagan must be turning over in his grave right now. But I think there are elements on the far right who want Putin to win, who admire that form of governance, and that's chilling. That's frightening. And you're right, there are echoes of the 1930s in the America First movement in the 1930s, which was called the America First movement in the 1930s, who openly sympathized with Hitler and were openly propagating Nazi propaganda in this city, in the halls of Congress even. There's a great podcast called Ultra by Rachel Maddow, the MSNBC host, that looks at this period. It's a very, very good historical podcast, regardless of politically what you think of Rachel. I think it's a brilliant podcast that looks at this period, but I see echoes of this. And it frightens me, not just for the sake of Ukraine, which I care about a lot, but for the sake of this country. It worries me. Now, on the left, we see something else. We see kind of this naivete that like everything can be negotiated about. On the far left, I still like to say the area between the 20-yard lines, to use a football metaphor in our political spectrum, is still pretty good, right? If you were to get a vote to the floor in both houses of Congress right now for aid to Ukraine, it would pass with overwhelming bipartisan majorities in both houses right now at this moment. But that virus that's spreading on the left and the right, on the right due to this misguided, bizarre, incomprehensible affinity for Vladimir Putin that we see on the American right, and this naivete that I think we see on the far left side of our spectrum, this could spread. We're already seeing it, the support in public opinion erode for supporting Ukraine. It's still a majority, but it used to be an unassailable majority. Now it's a very assailable and very fragile majority. And I think we all need to really speak up and get the message out about what is at stake. And our political leaders need to step up and say, to articulate to the American people who are not following this the way everybody in this room is following it, to explain. I'd like to see President Biden do an Oval Office address explaining what is in this for us right now. Because it's not just, there is a lot of it in it for us. Ukraine's doing the fighting for us right now. Ukraine has basically destroyed half of Russia's military capability for us, for pennies on the dollar of our defense budget, right? We're talking about less than 1% of the US federal budget that's going to Ukraine and less than 5% of the US defense budget. You ask me, that's a damn good bargain, right? For what we're getting in return. I want to see somebody explain that to the American public, because I haven't seen that happen yet. I'd also like to see the president add 2 words to what he always says about Ukraine. He says, we're there as long as it takes. I want two more words at the end of that sentence, to win. Because the only option here is victory. There is no other option except for victory.
Well, on that note, any last words? Okay. Well, in that case, thank you all so much for joining our conversation on Putin's disinformation gambit. And thank you to our panelists.